Hola, muy buenos días. Me da mucha alegría tenerlos a todos por aquí. Le agradezco muchísimo a nuestro presidente, el presidente de la FIAF, Frédéric Maire, que esté con nosotros para este arranque y por supuesto a Paolo Cherchi. Yo soy Hugo Villa, director general de la Filmoteca de la UNAM y nos da muchísima alegría que la UNAM junto con la FIAF hayamos podido rescatar de la pandemia este seminario que creo que es más importante que nunca. El saber hasta dónde pueden los desastres naturales y humanos hacerle daño a nuestro patrimonio fílmico y por lo tanto a la memoria compartida de toda la humanidad ya registrada desde 1890 y tantos en materiales cinematográficos y en imágenes en movimiento. Les agradezco
So
mucho.
I am very glad and that you are here, and you are all invited to join us during these sessions. Tomorrow we will have an earlier schedule. Please check your program. And today's session will be very, very special. So in a few moments, we will be beginning with Paolo. But I would like to give the floor to Frédéric, the president of the International Federation of Film Archives and also the director of the Swiss Film Archive in Lausanne. Please, Frédéric. Thank you, Hugo.
This first International Online Symposium organized by Filmoteca de la UNAM and FIAF. According that this event should have taken place in Mexico City, I will now switch to Spanish, so please tune on your simultaneous translation. Je vais donc passer à l'espagnol pour ceux qui écoutent et parlent français et vous prie de vous connecter à la traduction simultanée prévue. Estimados y estimadas
Dear
participantes,
participants in this exceptional online event, I would like first and foremost to thank the UNAM Film Archive and his director, Hugo Villa and his staff for organizing this symposium online and permitting that a very significant part of this FIAF Congress can be carried out to our satisfaction. So before we start, I would like to share a thought with our colleagues who are suffering the effects of the pandemic, and also a thought to those film archives who, for the reasons of the pandemic or economic or political reasons, are finding it difficult to survive. Film archives, audiovisual archives, are the memory of our times. The audiovisual materials that are part of our heritage opens a window to the world. Audiovisual content plays an increasingly critical role in our lives, mostly when we search to understand the world and commit ourselves to other members of to mankind. And this is why it is important to keep it open to everyone. We are now undergoing a natural disaster that is causing severe problems for humans and for film preservation. Certainly, the financial effects of the pandemic will strain our archives, and those that are already facing hardship will be increasingly under pressure. And this is why it is fundamental to see how we can collaborate in terms of natural disasters. Today, solidarity between countries, people, and institutions is the essential way in which we can understand the future. On behalf of FIAF, I would like to thank all of those who will be presenting during this online seminar. I welcome you all, and I wish you every luck in your endeavor. I would like to give the floor to Paolo Cherchi for his remarks. So the floor
Thank
is
you,
yours, Paolo.
Frédéric, and hello, everyone. Let me start by expressing my most sincere gratitude to our colleagues in Mexico, the organizers of this symposium, to the president of the International Federation of Film Archives, Frédéric Maire, and to the executive committee of FIAF for their kind invitation to participate in this online event. I'm deeply honored to be here with you today. I only wish we could see each other in person, but I hope this will be possible again in a not too distant future. The title of my talk is I Can't Breathe, Extinction Rebellion to Film Preservation, and I need to give you a brief explanation for the rationale of this choice. Over the past decade, I have offered a number of presentations to illustrate a very short speech I delivered on August 24th, 2010, at the British Film Institute in London to celebrate the centennial of the birth of Ernest Lindgren, founding curator of the National Film Library, now called the BFI National Archive. The text, now known as the Lindgren Manifesto, consists of 14 propositions. Over the years, I have given a talk on each of them at public conferences and workshops. The 14 propositions are the following, with my apologies to those of you who have heard or read them before. 1. Restoration is not possible and is not desirable, regardless of its object or purpose. Obedience to this principle is the most responsible approach to film preservation. 2. Preserve everything is a curse to posterity. Posterity won't be grateful for sheer accumulation. Posterity wants us to make choices. It is therefore immoral to preserve everything. Selecting is a virtue. 3. If film had been treated properly from the very beginning, there would be less of a need for film preservation today, and citizens would have had access to a history of cinema of their choice. 4. The end of film is a good thing for cinema, both as an art and as an artifact, so let's stop whining. 5. If you work for a cultural institution, make knowledge with money. If you work for an industry, make money with knowledge. If you work for yourself, make both in the order that's right for you. Decide what you want and then say it, but don't lie. 6. A good curator will never claim to act as such. Curatorship is a pledge of unselfishness. 7. Turning silver grains into pixels is not right or wrong per se. The real problem with digital restoration is its false message that moving images have no history. Its delusion of eternity. 8. Digital is an endangered medium and migration its terminal disease. Digital technology needs to be preserved before its demise. 9. We are constantly making images. We are constantly losing images, like any human body generating and destroying cells in the course of its biological life. We are not conscious of this, which is as good as it is inevitable. 10. Knowing that a cause is lost is not a good enough reason not to fight for it. 11. A curator must look for necessary choices with the ultimate goal of becoming unnecessary. 12. Governments want to save, not give money. So we should offer them economical solutions. Therefore, we should explain to them why the money they give to massive digitization is wasted. We should give them better options, such as treating with the utmost care what has survived. Better yet, doing nothing. Let moving images live and die on their own terms. 13. Honor your visual experience and reject the notion of content. Protect your freedom of sight. Exercise civil disobedience. The 14th and last proposition of the Lindgren Manifesto is the occasion for the thoughts I would like to share with you today, and it goes as follows. People can and should be able to live without artificial moving images. To illustrate my point, let me begin by quoting an eminent Canadian-American economist of the late 20th century, John Kenneth Galbraith, who used to say that, quote, "The only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable," end quote. His aphorism, an eloquent mirror of his maverick academic persona, may well be applied to the world's response to the COVID-19 pandemic that is ravaging the world and has done so from late 2019 to date, already with one of the worst death tolls from an infectious respiratory disease since the Spanish flu of 1918-1920. From early 2020, all sorts of predictions were formulated on the path of the virus and its possible consequences upon society, culture, and geopolitics. These prognostications ran the entire gamut between apocalypse and denial, often with scant evidence, as so little was and still is known about the origins and the causes of the phenomenon. There was no dearth of prophecies in the arts and entertainment sector either. The cinema and media content industries may not have been hit as hard as stage theater and live music, but the financial consequences of the coronavirus crisis are no less devastating. Live action filming has come to a halt in most countries. Close to 200,000 screens went abruptly dark in most of the planet's exhibition venues at the inception of the pandemic. Film festivals struggled to cope with the new normal. On a much smaller scale, the community of film museums and archives also suffered a significant blow in 2020, including the cancellation of the 76th Annual Congress and General Assembly of FIAF, scheduled to have been held in Mexico City on 2024 April this year. Now, the good news is that by executive committee decree, FIAF has given our colleagues in the Mexican capital another opportunity to host a Congress in 2023. The long-term repercussions of these traumatic circumstances on the future of the audiovisual heritage are anybody's guess, but some useful observation can be drawn from the immediate reactions to the COVID-19 pandemic in the main areas of activity associated with making, presenting, and safeguarding moving images. By sheer coincidence, the topic chosen a year ago for the Mexico City FIAF Congress, Preventing and Managing Natural and Human-Made Disasters in Film Archives, was in itself a harbinger of things to come. An almost accidental yet timely announcement of a theme now occupying center stage in the debate among professionals on the status of audiovisual media in relation to our natural environment. It is almost certain that the urgency of this subject matter will further escalate in the years to come. As the title of the Mexico City conference shows, the focus of film curators and archivists' growing concern is the overall set of catastrophic events threatening the life and permanent availability of moving image collections. In this respect, the issues confronting archival institutions are not fundamentally different from those affecting other forms of human creativity, such as books, paintings, manuscripts, and archaeological remains. The difference in the case of audiovisual works lies in the manifold connections between the works themselves and their modes of production, consumption, and conservation. Exploring them all in detail would be a daunting task in itself. So what follows is only a brief description of their core manifestations as they presented themselves in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. A roundtable discussion held on 17 September 2008 at the National Gallery in London, titled "Climate Change and Museum Collections," under the auspices of the International Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, IIC, aimed at discussing, quote, the implications of climate change and its effects upon cultural heritage, particularly that which is contained in museums and house collections, end quote. In his introductory speech, Jerry Podani, who was then president of the IIC, set the tone of the symposium with the recognition that, quote, the relatively small body of published work and research on the effects of climate change on cultural heritage concentrates on the built environment, sites, and the natural surround. Work concerned with the relationship between climate change and museum collections is all but non-existent, end quote. Little has changed in the intervening 12 years. Blunt as it was, Podani's statement was justified by the relative indifference of museum professionals to the imminent threat posed by systemic alterations of the natural environment upon the world's cultural heritage. Quote, I'd like you to imagine a spectrum, he said. On one end are informed and enlightened people who know that this challenge is, and who are struggling to find ways to address it. On the other end of the spectrum are the uninformed, the stubborn, and even those who are skeptical about the very existence of global warming and its effects. In between, there are, quote, many conservation and museum professionals who, through no fault of their own, remain unaware of the challenges that museums are about to face, end quote. Persuaded as they are that the artifacts entrusted to their responsibility are well protected within the material boundaries of their institutions, they ask, quote, well, the issue of climate change is so large, what could any individual conservator really do about it? End quote. In the domain of film preservation, this bias is compounded by the widespread belief that a moving image distributed in digital form is preserved, so to speak, in its own right by virtue of the medium in which it is presented or made available to the public. Notwithstanding the now fashionable interest in the materiality of creative works in cinematic form and in the technology that made them possible, the much lamented indifference to the nature of the physical carriers in photochemical images has not gone away. It is only expressed in different terms by an implicit or outspoken statement of faith in the virtues of the digital storage device, be it a hard drive, a server, or a cloud, supposedly ensuring the permanence of audiovisual content. From such a perspective, the price to pay for natural or human-made disasters affecting film museums or archives is relatively modest, insofar as the so-called content is safe. Earthquakes, wars, and climate change may eventually destroy the object without compromising access to the moving images somewhere, somehow. This entrenched perception of the audiovisual heritage as an immaterial entity is a leading cause of the lukewarm response by governments and media to the appeals launched by film curators and archivists for the conservation of film collections, let alone to the calls for a more responsible approach to the clear and present danger of irreversible global warming by cultural institutions in general. Private and public authorities may care to some extent about the effects of global warming and air pollution on the longevity of the Gutenberg Bibles or Pompeii murals. Less so for the 35mm nitrate negative of a widely known film classic. Such perspective, however, could also be reversed by looking at how the acts of making, exhibiting, and preserving moving images contribute to the problem itself by imposing additional burdens on the natural environment. One of the most remarkable ripple effects of the 2020 COVID-19 crisis is the blurring in the public perception of the distinction between natural and human-made disasters. Who we are and what we do is part of the problem. In a year marked by a virtual standstill in global film production and exhibitions, two works are likely to stand out as the most representative films of the year. First, the video taken with a mobile phone by an anonymous bystander on Monday, the 26th of May, showing white Minneapolis policeman Derek Chauvin kneeling on the neck of Black George Floyd, as the latter repeatedly says, "I can't breathe." The second is a short film called Dear Humans, an imagined letter from COVID-19 by Christine Flintz, featuring a poem recited in voiceover by the author. The film is no longer a single opus. It has become a loose conglomerate of independent or rogue audiovisual works, with the poem as their common denominator. Various versions in different languages and with various titles now appear on the internet. As in the case of the late George Floyd, people severely affected by COVID-19 cannot breathe or are gasping for air at home, in an emergency room, or in a hospice for the elderly. The earliest known version of the film Letter from COVID-19 appeared in March 2020 in the UK from a British animation studio called Creative Connection, with animation by Thomas Barter. Among many others is a version by Darinka Montico, which is a compilation of documentary and fictional footage. Moving image archives and museums should preserve these two works for posterity. In doing so, they should face once and for all the question of how to pursue their mission without contributing to global warming through their endeavors. Like filmmaking, moving image preservation is a highly polluting business. Some institutions within FIAF have taken significant measures to reduce their contribution to what a scholar from the University of Cambria, Jen Bendel, defined as, quote, the inevitable collapse, probable catastrophe, and possible extinction of our species, end quote. It is time to look at Jen Bendel's landmark essay, Deep Adaptation, a Map for Navigating Climate Tragedy, published in 2018, an influential manifesto of the Extinction Rebellion environmental movement, as a point of reference for future discussions on our responsibility towards future generations. Film conservation vaults can and should be powered by renewable sources of energy. The use of harmful materials can and should be reduced in the pursuit of film preservation projects. These efforts, however, should not be construed as an excuse to avoid a more fundamental question. What are we willing to give up for the sake of a cleaner world? Are we ready to renounce part of our goals and ambitions as cultural agents in the interest of a safer, more equal treatment of the natural resources at our disposal? On May 15, 2020, the Cinema Astra, one of the screening rooms at the Cinema Visionario in Udine, Italy, was equipped with a set of partitions between seats in order to implement social distancing required by the law, as film theaters were allowed to reopen under strict safety measures. They had been shut down nationwide since 8 March, although many of them had already closed on the 23rd of February. When film programs resumed, many of their audiences, as you know, were gone. An average of 16 people per screen were recorded in Italy on June 15, the first official day of activity across the country. In the autonomous region of Friuli Venezia Giulia, of which Udine is the capital, cinemas had been allowed to restart their operations a few weeks earlier. Quote, "The Cinema Visionario is ready to open its doors in a condition of maximum security and maximum comfort," end quote, said Sabrina Bracetti, the co-curator of the venue. Quote, "It is also the first movie," said Bracetti, movie theater trying out this method of alternating small safety areas, single, double, triple seat, reconfiguring the new Sala Astra's capacity from 173 to 105 seats, end quote. The so-called butterfly seating system, boasting a special antibacterial faux leather surface designed by Lino Sonego for the Cinema Visionario, was not quite the first of its kind. Its earlier incarnation in a film theater setting goes back to 1970, when, for New York's Anthology Film Archives, filmmaker Peter Kubelka designed the Invisible Cinema, consisting of high-winged partition seats with blinders at each side. It was a short-lived experiment, as the partitions were eventually dismantled in 1974, truly visionary in its radical statement about spectatorship. So ironically, a film theater called Visionario fulfilled Peter Kubelka's concept by proxy, as well as by force majeure. In the meantime, the internet, one of the big winners in the COVID-19 war, has snatched a significant percentage of theatrical audiences to the brave new world of streaming, embraced by billions of former film spectators as a practical alternative to the collective cinematic experience. It must be acknowledged that the lockdown imposed by governments on most nations of the world has allowed viewers to discover the holdings of film collecting institutions through their existing or newly established internet portals. The extent to which this will benefit film museums and archives in the long run is another matter. The FIAF website almost immediately provided a list of affiliates online film platforms, a resource which has been extremely well used, as has the so-called programming game, which at this time had already received more than 15 contributions. Time will tell whether or not this turn of events will inflict a fatal blow to the ailing business of film exhibition. It is safe to say, however, that one of its most glamorous expressions has not fared well at all in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. Film festivals had unwittingly become the victims of an identity crisis since the beginnings of the 21st century through a gradual process of commodification, which they authorized and eventually endorsed. With very few exceptions, they are now regarded as ancillary outlets of the corporate world, glittering remnants of the allegedly outdated mode of collective theatrical experience of the moving image. The COVID-19 acted as a Trojan horse of their ultimate subjugation to neo-capitalism, turning the victim into a perpetrator of a ruthless distortion of their own original mission. The increasingly competitive atmosphere in which film festivals were pushed to operate during the past 2 decades is no mystery to anyone acquainted with the entertainment industry and the cultural marketplace. The degree of cynicism displayed by their main players in handling the COVID-19 emergency has nevertheless reached troublesome proportions, dragging a large portion of the film festival community towards a battle royale against the backdrop of the new emerging media giants. Within weeks, a carefully negotiated calendar of public events was turned into a no man's land in which the conquest of a suitable programming slot is the outcome of a gross Darwinian scheme in the form of a chicken game. Whoever blinks first, by canceling a film festival or turning it into a virtual event, loses not only the territory, but its exploitation rights. The supposed umpire in the survival of the fittest contest is the coronavirus itself. The chances of a resurgence in the epidemic at a given time of the year, the ability of or willingness of attendees to maintain an adequate distance from each other during the show, their opportunity to travel from one country to another, the number of available seats in the theater, or the existence, availability, and size of open-air venues, and so forth. To expose and denounce the callousness of such a modus operandi and its pretense of consideration for people's well-being is not enough. COVID-19 may or may not go away, but the question remains, what are film festivals really for in the digital age? The objections raised by Jen Bendel's paper to the business as usual response to human-made tragedies also applies with renewed poignancy to the field of so-called arts and entertainment. A simple litmus test could be adopted to verify the appropriateness of Bendel's remarks to the work of film production, exhibition, and preservation. One could ask, for instance, the rationale for flying across continents in order to see a film that will be distributed all around the world within days, if not hours, for the consumption by a single Hollywood production of enough electric power to meet the needs of a sub-Saharan country for a whole year, for releasing large amounts of CO2 in order to keep film prints and negatives cool, and for contributing to the use of non-recyclable plastic, chemicals, and metallic ores for the photochemical or digital preservation of a cinematic work. Being fully aware of the consequences and able to imagine alternatives to the status quo does not guarantee a solution per se, but may be the beginning of a way out from inaction. Doing nothing about it was always questionable. It is now, to put it plainly, unacceptable. My conclusion is that the COVID-19 pandemic is a letter worth reading and interpreting. Its message resonates within and beyond the film preservation community. The time for complacency is over. We cannot breathe. We are gasping for air in environmental terms indeed, but also in the political and cultural sphere. Taking full responsibility for our actions towards posterity, both as film archivists and curators and as fellow citizens of our planet, can and should be one and the same thing. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I'll be happy to take questions, if any.
Hello. Does anybody have a question? You can use the Q&A feature on the Zoom screen, or if you are on a tablet or a mobile device, you can use the feature there as well. I think that more than a question, I would like to refer as Paolo's position as a very responsible attitude. As Frédéric said at the beginning, solidarity will be fundamental not only for film archives, but particularly for the survival and growth of film archives. This call to action by Paolo is quite relevant, I find. The time for complacency and whining is over. And in his own words, we are trying to breathe again, and we need to think of shared actions to see our archives thrive. I don't know if you have any questions. We have a few questions now. Paolo, can you read those questions, or do you want me to ask those questions and you just answer them?
Yes, there is an anonymous attendee who's asking, could you give some suggestions on eco-friendly practices we can employ in our archives? Well, I could say to begin with, we could do something more than we're doing now, in my opinion, to use renewable sources of energy in order to allow our collections to be kept in a climate control environment. I know that some film archives and museums are doing that. I think more of them should do the same. I'm also aware of a wonderful storage facility in Northern Europe, in Finland, that uses a natural environment. It is an archive built literally inside a mountain with a great saving of energy. It is an interesting solution that I think is worth considering for other collections. In short, the very least we could do is to stop thinking that the preservation of film collection is something that can be done without concern for the pollution of the air. Renewable energies are at least a first step.
There's another question from our anonymous spectator, and there's also they're listening from Bangladesh. Welcome. Do you want to take
There is another question. Someone wants to know about the 14 points of the Lindgren Manifesto. The 14 points were published in the Journal of Film Preservation sometime shortly after 2010. Another anonymous attendee says, I believe this is not new, but without the pandemic, it's very hard for archives like ours to have sufficient fundings for our operations. Now that we are experiencing this pandemic, the question is, how do you think we should fight for our survival? I understand that this refers to the political aspect of our sustainability. Well, it is indeed a political question. I've always remained convinced, and I still am, that the way we have been passively accepting the recommendations, shall we call them recommendations from the digital industry, has not served our cause well. We have put ourselves in the hands of a technological racket, and now we are beginning to pay the price for it at the cost of the environment as well. But political choices are something that could be considered both from a technical and an organizational viewpoint, from a variety of viewpoints, in fact. But I would argue that when we think about how our organizations are operating and look across the gamut of all their aspects, there are many aspects of what we do that can be considered from an environmental perspective. I also mentioned traveling to film festivals, traveling to conferences. That's another possible topic for discussion.
Veo por ahí que está levantada la mano de
I
Pamela.
see that Pamela Pavani has raised her hand, but I don't know if any of those questions is yours. And Paolo, there are more questions from other anonymous attendees from Brazil. We have Amal Ahmed and a couple of anonymous attendees as well. Would you like to read
which
those
question
questions?
are you referring to?
¿A qué
Because I see
pregunta?
many of them here.
Eh,
One from Brazil.
con la que te sientas cómodo que
The one that you prefer to answer. There are many questions now.
Yes. Well, the question from Brazil is, what do you recommend to our archivists? Boy, it's hard to follow them all. As a course of action to bring light to our problem, even in our present COVID-19 crisis. I think that the first thing we should do is to talk, to make our own voice heard, to talk internally with our colleagues, with our staff, and to stop talking to the outside world as if the problem did not exist. We are now so used to presenting the bright side of what we are doing and to neglect the problematic aspects of our activity that it is perhaps hard to start now, but we should. I think that the discussion that has been held in the public sphere on the internet about film festival has been very, very useful. It has brought to light the question of the identity of film festivals, and in this case, of the consequences of this crisis of identity in film festivals in relation to the environment. Some festivals have taken very responsible decisions in order to take into account the COVID-19 crisis, but by doing so, they also started asking themselves the question, are we useful as cultural entities, or are we contributing to global warming through what we are doing? That's a beginning. Discussing openly in a transparent manner is the beginning of a solution.
Creo que hay otra por ahí, un poco más abajo.
There's another question. Amal Ahmed's question, or another question from another anonymous attendee that you would like to answer?
Someone asked the name of the British animation studio I was referring to. If you bear with me, I can give you again the name of the animation studio. It is called Creative Connection, and the animation of the film is by Thomas Barter, B-A-R-T-E-R.
Hay una hasta abajo de Caroline Yeager.
The last question by Caroline Yeager. I don't know if you can read that question, Paolo.
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
There's a question from Caroline Yeager. Those of you who are watching YouTube, you can also send questions through YouTube. We might not be able to answer all of them, but we can answer a few of them. So Caroline Yeager says,
the question is the very materials of film that we conserve, nitrate, acetate, polyester, and digital, are created with chemicals and processes that are damaging to the environment. Photochemical preservation continues to perpetuate this pollution. How do we address these fundamental issues in our practices to conserve moving images? Well, that is an excellent question. I would also add that in the photochemical motion picture film also makes use of animal parts. Gelatin is made of crushed animal bones. And that's something that has always been known, and it's something also worth considering. Animals are killed, and part of their bodies are being used in order to make motion picture film. Let's talk about that as well. But this brings me back to the reason why I use this as an illustration of the 14th point of my Lindgren Manifesto. How important is it for us to create moving images? Is there an ethical approach to the creation of moving images? Do we realize how important this gesture is? What are the consequences of creating moving images for our own pleasure, for information, for education, for entertainment? Is it really necessary to create moving images? If you ask what's most polluting, photochemical business or the digital business is ultimately more polluting because of the nature of the chemicals involved in the productions of the object we use in order to create moving images. But the same question applies to the photochemical domain as well. Meanwhile, however, we are dealing with moving images that are already being made. We have films in our vaults that need to be preserved. They already exist. Our profession deals with ensuring their availability for posterity. So the very least we can do is to engage in this activity without making things worse. We can, we should. I am no longer satisfied with the answer, well, we should take into account the reality of our economy, our society, and our environment. That's not enough for me. I find it increasingly unacceptable to simply go with the flow and do what everybody else is doing simply because that's the way the world goes. No, given that we know that there are ways to protect our collections without damaging the environment, we should give it a try. And if we can't, take the consequences of this. I also would like to thank the anonymous attendee who told me here that the name of the video making of the murder of George Floyd is known. I was not aware of that. I'm going to look for the name, and of course I would be very happy to make this name public. Alejandra Espansad is asking, how do you think COVID has given the FIAF Symposium an opportunity to become more accessible now that it is free and easily accessible from I lost the question, hold on. The question has disappeared from my screen. I can no longer read the question.
¿Cuál pregunta?
Here it is again. Will this more democratic format continue somehow in the future? So the Alejandra is saying that the FIAF Symposium, the COVID-19 has given the FIAF Symposium an opportunity to become more accessible now that it's free and is accessible from any country. Will this more democratic format continue somewhere in the future? Well, I do think that this very symposium is an experiment in increased accessibility of our debate as film curators and archivists. So it is something that is in itself a useful experiment. And I hope that this will continue in the future, but let's see how it works. Catherine Corman is asking, how long do you think we have to plan for when we talk about posterity? Well, that's anybody's guess. My own frame of reference is millennia. if we think that moving images, if we think that film is a cultural entity, is a cultural phenomenon, we should treat film the same way we should treat the pyramids or ancient Greek remains or the early art of China, millennia. That's our term of reference. I would not settle for anything less than that. Another question, how will film archives and festival concretely cope with pandemic if it will last, for example, many years? Are they already taking into account this long-term possibility, and how? That's an excellent question. I don't have an answer to this. I have an impression, judging from what I'm hearing from colleagues, I think that our horizon currently is 2 weeks. We are unable to go any further than that. I was invited to an event on January 8th, and then I already asked myself, January 8th, will I be able to go anywhere on January 8th? I don't know. But your guess is as good as mine.
Hay, Paolo, par de preguntas que vienen vía YouTube.
Paulo, there are another 2 questions from YouTube. Rebecca Riviero asks, how is it possible not to avoid translating the film archives into political archives?
Oh, how to avoid turning the cultural memory into corporate memory? That's a matter of opinion. I can think of several different solutions, but I'm afraid that my own opinion would not be shared by the majority of the people attending this online symposium. There are many ways to stress the difference.
Y la otra que teníamos también ahí.
And our other question is from Sebastián Úbeda, who says, in Latin America, we can read the book on the death of cinema because it has been translated. Can you speak about the last portion of your book,
well, yes,
the aphorisms that you mentioned there?
Well, in that book, I have offered my own definition of film preservation. And I think that 20 years later, I think I can still stand by that definition. I no longer believe in film preservation per se. Film preservation is impossible. What we really can, as film curators and archivists, what we can do is to be the messengers of the way the moving image has evolved over the years. We cannot stop the migration of one moving image format into another. We cannot stop the transition from one way of seeing moving images to another. But what we can do is to try to protect those that existed. I would like to be able, I told this many times, both in conferences and to the students of the Selznick School of Film Preservation, I would like to know that sometime, at some point, someone will be able, 100 years from now, to explain to students, look, there was a time when people were looking at moving images on this little thing, in this object. That's how millions, billions of people saw moving images. They saw it on this box. Isn't that funny? They were using this object. That's the way it was done. Are we ready to start thinking in those terms? Are we ready to think that there is a need to explain to future generations that at a certain point in history, moving images were perceived and experienced in this way? So my own opinion about the goal of film preservation is to make sure not that the images will stay the same, because they will not stay the same. They cannot stay the same And given their nature, they should not stay the same. But what we can and should do is to find a way to explain to future generations that over time, moving images were experienced in different ways. That's the film preservation I believe in. And this applies both to the photochemical and to the digital domain. That's my own definition of film preservation. That's in chapter 51 of the book you have mentioned. Someone, Christopher Grove, is asking, do you think that one day it may be possible that celluloid acetate 35mm filmmaking may return and replace digital filmmaking again? The answer is yes. It is very well possible. It has been proven that manufacturing motion picture stock is not that difficult. It is certainly easier than manufacturing digital images from scratch. The George Eastman Museum, where I worked for many years, has proven that manufacturing photochemical film is not that difficult. There is an anonymous attendee who's asking the latest question I heard here. It is not possible to know how many people, institutions, especially from Africa, who have registered for these online workshops. Hugo, maybe that you should answer the question. I don't know.
I was in the midst of solving a technical problem. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, an anonymous attendee is, I'm reading this. Is it not possible to know how many people, institutions, especially from Africa, who have registered for these online workshops?
Sí es posible.
It is possible to know that. We have checked our lists of registered attendees, so we can compare that list with Frédéric and Christophe just to be sure of how many people were connected to the seminar. This is something that we will know around the second or third day of our sessions. I think that we have we are short of time now, and we will send the rest of the questions to Paolo so that he can answer that. Frédéric, thank you very much for honoring us with your presence during the inaugural ceremony. And Paolo, thank you very much. I think that your keynote speech was very sound and gives us many ideas of the many paths that we can follow and where we can direct the debate in the next few sessions. I think that my colleagues from the first discussion are here. I would like to give the floor, if Paolo and Frédéric agree, I will give a floor to Rachel so that she can introduce the rest of the members of the panel, and we can start with our presentations and the debate. So to the extent possible, please send your questions to the Q&A session module in Zoom. And if you have any technical issues, please send us an email and we will try to solve that problem or chat with you. Thank you very much. I'll be around until Rachel is ready, and we'll see you in a bit.
Good morning. Thank you so much to Hugo and to all of our colleagues at UNAM, Albino, Maria, Luisa. Thank you all for managing to put this symposium together after it had been canceled in our live version. So thanks for that, and to our FIAF colleagues who have contributed, and to Frédéric. Paulo, what a fantastic jumping off point for this conversation this week and for all of our panelists. As you can all see from the program, the thread of the conversations all week are really focused on disasters. And that includes sort of environmental, man-made through neglect or other ways, political, and the wide implications of what that means. So this morning, I am really quite honored to have a panel that is specifically focused on Latin America. Some of these presentations will focus on some of the really relevant conversations that we've all been following, specifically in Brazil and other countries, as you'll see. So I know that there might be a lot of discussions around this, so I also wanted to clarify to everyone that all 4 panelists will be presenting and the Q&As will happen after all 4 panelists are complete. So first, thanks so much. I'm so honored to be kicking this off and to have been part of the scientific committee as part of this. So thank you to everyone. So our first speaker is Fabiana Fajera from the Universidad de Brasilia. Her paper is going to be the 5 decades of public policies for memory in Brazil, the case of the Cinematheca Brasileira. So thanks so much to her. And if everyone could give their attention to her, we will be listening. Thank you.
Rachel, we're waiting. We're having a technical issue with Fabiana.
Okay.
If you want, I think that we can get started with. I think Roque and Circe are with us. Is that correct?
Okay.
Yes. So we can get started with them, and let's see if we can fix the bug that we have. Fabiana, please.
Okay, then everyone forget that I just introduced Fabiana. We'll switch ahead to Roque Gonzalez Galvan and Circe Sanchez, who we're delighted to have with us here from UNAM. Their paper topic is Anthropo-Natural Causes of Risk for Film Archives in Latin America and Their Management, the cases in Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. So we'll try it again. Circe and Roque.
Hola, Roque.
Hello, Roque.
Hola, hola. Hola a todos. No sé si me están viendo bien.
I don't know if everybody is seeing me. Your camera is closed. There you go. Now we can see you. All right. Apologies for this little technical hiccup. And hello. Good morning. Good day to all of you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. Yes, I am happy to speak and share this presentation with you, with my colleague, Licenciada Circe Sanchez. And we'll address the cases of Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. And what regards the most important presentations and archives in those countries. We'll attempt to review a panorama, not only of the characteristics and the preparation of these film archives, but we'd also like to focus not only on the cases of natural disasters as such, but as is stated in the title, what are the anthroposocial causes? What is often called in different institutions and even on a national level, many countries call these man-made causes. we can think of the most notable one, the Chernobyl disaster, or oil tanker spills, or buildings that blow up because of poor electrical and other construction issues. So we want to review what are the decisions, what's the way in which mankind has managed policies and the various paradigms that are handled to address the human, social, cultural rights and how people have addressed the various policies and paradigms, and what is the understanding of community and of respect, not only for humankind, but also for the environment, as well as for cultural resources, the cultural heritage, if you will, of people. So we're going to look at the case of film archives as an example of this, and of the, as Usaid has called, neo-capitalism, and this neoliberal state of capitalism, where the situation of capitalism where the state has withdrawn, and we see rather 50 to 70% of budgets are putting in certain and sure risk not only a majority of cultural institutions and cultural heritage, but the efforts that took decades, many, many years to build, and are at near risk of extinction. And how this is an issue that could overwhelm us. And we'd like to specifically focus on how this has been handled from a policy standpoint, from a human decision-making paradigm. Latin America is an extensive region covering a wide variety of different circumstances in the territory. And we see also a lot of natural phenomena and natural disasters, earthquakes and others. According to a 2013 survey and study by the United Nations on the issue of risk and cultural heritage, CRESPIAL, I think, is the acronym. I don't remember the acronym in English, but they study the link between cultural patrimony and risk. And they said that since 1990 and 2013, which was the period that review, 2014 or 2015 was the publication of that report, and they do a joint study in which 16 different Latin American countries participated. And according to that study, Mexico and Colombia are the two countries who have experienced the largest number of disasters. 40 to 50% of the disasters affecting the 16 countries that we're studying, and after a review of each of those in terms of the number of deaths caused, the number of destroyed buildings or destroyed, these two countries, Colombia and Mexico, represent almost half of all of those situations. And for that reason, we've focused on these two countries. My colleague will further look at the decades of history of the film archives that are the most important in Latin America, specifically the case of Brazil's Cinematheque Brasileira in Sao Paulo. And we'll do a review of the situation in Latin America, specifically as to how natural disasters have affected these cultural archives in Latin America. So my colleague Circe will look at the case of Mexico. And then we'll look at the case of Colombia and Brazil. All right, here we are. If you will allow, I'll share with you the results of the study we took on the case of Mexico. As our presentation will be in Spanish, I also want to say a word of thanks to our interpreters. Mexico is the third largest country of the region of Latin America and the 10th largest in the world. And it's a country that's affected by droughts, volcanic activity, cyclones, and some of the largest earthquakes in the world have occurred in Mexico City on the same day, 19th of September of 1985 and 2017. Mexico has for years prepared to face these climate phenomena together with the National Center, the Seismic Institute, and the National Civil Protection Institute, which together make up the group of institutions to face natural risks. Since 1982, Mexico has worked on a program to preserve the film archive of the world. Memoria del Mundo was the Mexican committee set up in 1996, making up Mexican specialists from throughout the country. Thanks to the enormous wealth of this record, Mexico is in the 5th place in the world in terms of film archives. Luis Buñuel's Los Olvidados is one of the most important records recognized by the UNESCO organization. And when talking about the Cinemateca Nacional, the Mexican film archives, it was founded in 1974 during the presidency of Luis Echeverría. Its first headquarters was in the Churubusco Film Studios on Tlalpan Avenue in the southern area of the city. It was made up of 3 film auditoriums, an exhibit area, a bookstore, a restaurant, a safety vault, and a workshop to preserve and to work on film conservation. It has participated in FIAF since for many years and has organized a number of different educational programs in favor and in support of Mexican film production. It collaborates nationally as well as internationally on the preservation, promotion, and exhibition of the film archives in Mexico and of the world. In 1982, the Cinemateca had a catastrophic fire around 7 in the evening. There was an explosion, and the origin of that explosion are still unknown to date. A number of the auditoriums were showing films in that afternoon, and a number of people resulted injured, and there were even some deaths. There were also children who were trampled on by the crowds as they sought to leave. And the fire lasted 15 hours and required the assistance of fire brigades from different areas of the city. It is believed that more than 90% of the documentary film archive that includes the golden age of Mexican period in the mid-20th century, called the seventh art. As a result of this man-made disaster, and after years of design and production, the Cinemateca Nacional moved to the present Joco neighborhood in Mexico City. The authorities sought to improve the structure as well as to improve the services towards the public. There are 6 storage sites that are up to temperature control following the standards set by FIAF to protect its archives. A laboratory for film restoration was set in place, and this is also able to support other efforts in the rest of Mexico as well as internationally. For film exhibition sites are available, and there's a collection of more than 350 documents and a digital library of 60,000 titles of world and Mexico's cinema. There are specific protections against fire and first aid facilities. In recent months, the activity of the Cinemateca Nacional had to reduce its activities because of the COVID pandemic and due to budget restrictions of the current government that affected a 70% reduction of all public institutions. The Cineteca has also had to cut back on some of its programming, including an improvement to the air conditioning facilities, as well as some of its substantive programming efforts. In terms of, despite these budgetary restrictions, because of a governmental decree, this is protected by government legislation. Part of its funding comes from the government itself, and it generates and it is well regarded and much loved by Mexican society. Now we'll consider the case of the UNAM Film Archives. The Filmoteca of the Autonomous University of Mexico City was founded on July 1960, and one of its founders was Dr. Luis Anuel Casanova, a seminal figure in film research and Mexican film history. The Filmoteca also joined FIAF in 1977 as a member. The Filmoteca of UNAM works on film production, promotes and carries out different film exhibitions, festivals, and interdisciplinary film congresses, in addition to working in film preservation of various audiovisual material from various sources. In 1980, UNAM's film archive were in a building near the university campus, and it also suffered a fire, not as important as the one that affected the National Film Archives, but this was due to an electrical short circuit. Over time, and thanks to great efforts, most of the material of the UNAM collection were able to be safeguarded and recovered. Fortunately, the collection of the UNAM Filmoteca had been distributed in different buildings throughout Mexico City, and next to the Che Guevara auditorium, and underneath that laboratory that was part of the collection. Another was in a different neighborhood very close to the university campus. Another was located in one of the training rooms of the University Olympic Stadium, and also in the San Ildefonso Center in the historic heart of the city. In 1985, the first specialized storage location was built for nitrate films that required special care because of the risk of fire. In addition to building this next to the emblematic Olympic Stadium of the university campus, in 1985, 6 climate-controlled storage centers were built to house the film collection in front of the Political and Social Sciences building of UNAM. In 1986, the first stage of the administrative building was begun, and these began to be occupied in 1988, and later the conservation workshop as well as the restoration. The new buildings that are currently occupied were begun shortly thereafter from 1985, and the 2017 were the most significant man-made disasters. There were the measures adopted by UNAM's film collection are to have a area in the area where personnel is able to protect itself with specific equipment and fire extinguishers. And this has a fire alarm system as well, which is regularly kept up, as well as the emergency services of the fire brigades, which is 4 kilometers away. In recent months, the activity, due to the budgetary and other restrictions as a result of the pandemic, one of the strengths of UNAM's film collection is that it belongs to not only one of the most important universities of Mexico and Latin America, but of the world. UNAM is protected by law and receives public funding, which allows it to have both the material and other resources to be able to work in optimal conditions. So this concludes the presentation on the case of Mexico, and now we'll hear about the case of Brazil and Colombia.
So I'll give you a screenshot on Colombia. So for the biggest part of the 20th century, Colombia did not have a film tradition as Mexico or Brazil or Argentina already had, but it has grown a lot in the 21st century, particularly after Law 814 in 2013 was passed. So for nearly 20 years, there has been an outstanding organizational strategy by the different sectors of the audiovisual chain. As regards their heritage, they have CENIERA, which is the main institution for film archiving in Colombia. It has been operating for several decades now, and it is a full member of FIAF. Jorge Nieto, who was the director, was part of the FIAF Executive Committee from 1993 to 1997. In fact, if my memory doesn't fail me, the 53rd FIAF Congress took place in Cartagena, in Colombia. So in general, they have the Ministry of Culture and the National Council for Arts and Film Culture, CENIAC, and the film department are all share the responsibility and safeguard of the film heritage. All these institutions share the safeguarding of film archives, and they are also work with the National Archives. So this is a very important institution in Latin America. I would say, in fact, that they are at the forefront. Usually, they fall victims of financial crisis and political crisis, and Colombia has had many important crises with drug trafficking and guerrilla, etc. However, they have been able to do something about it, and they are organizing the 17th edition of the National Reunion of Film Archives. So they have 20 small departments throughout Colombia in their provinces, and they want every provincial capital to have a district representation, and their bylaws contain a mark on preservation of the film heritage. So much has been done, but still much is to be done. There is another important film archive in Bogota, which was founded in 1951, so it's nearly 50 years old, and the Medellin Film Archive was created in 2007, and it's there is another one in on the Caribbean that is in headquartered in Barranquilla, and we also have another film archive in Cali, which is new, just like the Medellin one. So it is very interesting to see how different government entities interact among them for the safeguard of film archives. And not long ago, several representatives from throughout the country and who work on film preservation had a meeting on disaster prevention. These topics are more within the field of expertise of the National Archives, and they were working together with them. So I would like to give you a couple of details. The Foundation for the Colombian Film Heritage has 6 vaults for storage, and they have tens of thousands of audiovisual material. They also have a cultural center, a library, and it is right at the center of Bogota. So people like going there. They have a newspaper archive as well. So it's really a really good archive. As I was saying, Colombia is growing very much, and they are growing a lot. They have not faced any disaster as the one we saw in Mexico, or the disasters that have occurred in Brazil. But I would like to speak about Brazil now because, I would like to speak about Sao Paulo Film Archive. They had several fires, and one was in 2016 on the nitrate deposit. There was another fire in 1957, one in 1969, and one in 1982. So somebody who will speak about Brazil will explain this better, but the archive has grown very much. But as I said during the introduction of my presentation, these accidents are human-made. The way in which you administer the resources and that you manage the resources have much to do. The government of the governments have much to do, like that of Jair Bolsonaro, which is so right-winged and so religious, and it has caused so many fires in the Amazonian jungle, and they are also misogynistic and homophobic, and they have many uh, things like this, and there are many requests from the Sao Paulo Film Archive because there is now full-fledged intervention from the military. So before Bolsonaro, there was already some meddling by the military. They were trying to get rid of any films that were critical of the status quo or the way things are done, or any LGBTI related films. They were censored, and they were proposing that military themes were taken on. But this year, the military are directly intervening and are actually laying off the staff. They actually closed the film archive, and that poses a huge danger. There are tens of thousands of audiovisual materials, and there are posters, there are scripts, there are newspapers. As you can see in the picture, you can see what happened in the National Museum of Brazil. Many of us were drawn to tears for this because we can see the Maracanã Stadium. It's beautiful there. It's beautiful and new, um, and shining for the soccer World Cup. But because there were some budget cuts, uh, and in spite of what the professionals said, there were risks. The installations were bad, and it happened. It was just a story of a death foretold, really, as Garcia Marquez would say. So many important works of the heritage of Brazil have been lost to bad practices of neo-capitalism, as Cherchi Usai said. So there is a mismanagement and there is a lack of control, not only in Brazil, but in different parts of the world. We see that there are leaders like Duterte and Trump and Salvini in Italy. So another thing that I would like to say is something about the CTAB, which is the Brazilian Audio Technical Center. And this is managed by professionals of the sector. But the thing is that a few weeks ago, there was a dentist, a female dentist, appointed by Bolsonaro to be the director of this audiovisual center. So, of course, there are protests, but we still have that lady in charge of that. So, in conclusion, as you can see, I would like to mention an author who is from Scotland. He is saying that there are no natural disasters. Nell Smith is his name. And we say that policies and human intervention and reinforced capitalism and neoliberal capitalism have all normalized disasters, and we all blame it on nature. And So this what does is just concealing and trying to hide unfair and unjust power relations. And different parts of the population are suffering this. And certainly this is also affecting culture and heritage in general. So with all its problems and different crises, in Latin America, there are some countries that have made a huge effort to be able to prevent natural disasters. So the thing is that we are now in jeopardy of losing all that progress. And that is happening not only in developing countries. So as Circe said, there have been huge budget cuts and people who are not trained to manage this, and just appointing somebody to a position for political convenience, we should be protesting for that. But we should be speaking about those problems, and we should perhaps draft the universal rights of heritage. And the problems with cultural heritage should be just as visible as ecocides or femicides. So something like we could call a heritage site or something like that, where those who are responsible for the disasters be punished, severely punished. So with this, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Roque y Circe. Thank you so much for your excellent presentation and insight into Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil, and also touching on some of the natural disasters that so many of our archives have faced over the years. So thank you, and we will make sure we have time at the end for our questions and answers. I am delighted. We'll go ahead and move on. We do have Fabiana Fajera here now, for sure. I'm delighted to be able to introduce her. Again, she's here from the Universidad de Brasilia, and she's going to be speaking of 5 decades of public policies for memory in Brazil, the case of the Cinemateca Brasileira. And we're delighted to have you. And again, speakers, if you could keep your eye on me towards the end, I will give you a 5-minute warning, a 1-minute warning, and then a time's up. So thank you so much and welcome, Fabiana.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. It's a pleasure to be here today. I apologize for my delay because I had technical issues. Unfortunately, the pandemic can make us close together, but also it can make us have difficult issues that sometimes we cannot solve in the fast pace. Just to introduce myself, I am a master's degree in information science. I had just graduated with my master's diploma this past February. And I will present to you today the results of my research on my master's program. I am also a public servant for the Brazilian Institute of Museums, which is an agency attached to the Ministry of Tourism here in Brazil. So I would like to start with my PowerPoint presentation, and then maybe we can leave the answers to questions for after my presentation. Let me see if I can do this. Hold on. Okay, can you see me? Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so this is the research that I have done for the past 2 to 3 years at the University of Brasilia at the Faculty of Information Science. So I tried to do a 50-year anniversary of the Cinemateca Brasileira. So my issues were basically the apparent gap in federal institutions' competencies, observing the public policies in Brazil for the past 50 years. I have found that there were no really public policies for audiovisual preservation. So my assumptions were that there were a possible void of memory and heritage policies, as well as in the audiovisual ones. As you may know, the Cinemateca Brasileira is part of the government since 1984. And I have noticed that it was first part of the heritage sector, and then it went to the audiovisual sector. And so my question was how it affects the preservation of audiovisual collections. So basically, this is my design to simplify my question is, in between all those issues and sectors, audiovisual, public policies, memory and heritage, who is in the middle of the circles? Meaning, who in the federal government should be responsible for all those 3 sectors in one, which would be the preservation of audiovisual. So I have done this timeline for the federalized institutions in Brazil that deal with memory, heritage, and audiovisual. It begins back in the 1818. As our colleague has already mentioned, the Museu Nacional. And our first audiovisual collection was taken to the museum, National Museum in 1912. So in 2018, we had a fire on that institution and we lost everything that was there in terms of audiovisual collections. In 1838, the National Archive was found, and in 1975, they created a Department of Audiovisual Documents. In 1936, IFAN was created, which is a heritage and memory patrimony for urban and architecture mainly. And in the year 2000, IFAN created the immaterial heritage for other memory issues to the public sector. In 1944-49, the Filmoteca of the Museu of São Paulo was created, and that was the first piece of the Cinemateca Brasileira. That's where it was created. The black dots that I marked in tiny marks in 1954 and 1969 were the fires that occurred at the Cinemateca Brasileira. So in 1975, the federal government created the Centro Nacional de Referência Cultural, which was an idea that was a much broader political sector for the heritage and memory. And at the CNRC, the Cinematheque was thought as a heritage and memory institution. In 1984, the Cinematheque went to the federal government officially under the IFAN. And in 2003, I put it here, the creation of IBRAM, which is the institute that I work nowadays. That is a sector for museum public policies. It used to be a department within IFAN, and now it is an independent agency attached to the Ministry of Tourism. I'm sorry, hold on. Okay, so this is a basic timeline because Brazilian public policy is very complex and it changes very fast. Almost every government makes changes in the political situation, and it affects the public sector and the public agencies. So here we would see that the Cinemateca Brasileira was first from 1984 to 2020. It went through IFAN, that was in 1994. And then in 2003, it changes to the Secretariat for Audiovisual. So it goes from the audiovisual memory and heritage to the audiovisual sector. In 2016, it suffers another fire. And in 2018, the Secretary for Audiovisual writes a contract with a private sector non-profit organization to do the management for the Cinematheque. So then in 2019, that contract is interrupted by the federal government, shutting down all the monitoring and all the professionals who were there preserving and maintaining the collections. So much so that in 2020, the Cinematheque had to be shut down. We can go through this past 2 years of Bolsonaro's government in a little bit later, because that was not part of my research on my master's program. I could never imagine that would be the result. So that was just one consideration after all my research was done in 2019. Okay, so this is basically, I'm sure everybody knows already, it is a federal representative for audiovisual preservation matters. It is under the Ministry of Tourism and under the Secretary of Audiovisual. So the Cinematheque changed from 1984 to the Memory and Heritage Agency, IFAN, and goes to the Secretariat of Audiovisual under Ministry of Culture in 2003. And then when Temer was president of Brazil in 2018, it extinguished the Ministry of Culture, and then he took it back because of the public sector was very intense about the manifests, and Bolsonaro extinguished again in 2019. So now the Cinemateca Brasileira is under the Ministry of Tourism. As you all know, we have over 250,000 reels, over 1 million documents, and we have built over 50 years of capacity building for professional and technicians. And the Cinematheque is also the legal deposit for Brazilian filmmakers since 1993, meaning that whoever gets foment and budget from the federal government to produce movies in Brazil, they do have to make a copy to make a deposit at the Cinemateca Brasileira. So those are basically a timeline of conclusions that I have done on my master's, which is from 84 to 2002. The memory and heritage sector in the federal government did not embrace the audiovisual preservation issues, even though the Cinemateca Brasileira was part of that sector. Once that was changed in 2003, also the audiovisual sector could not hold the demands of that one specific sector, the preservation of audiovisual. In 2008, the National Culture Plan was revised and includes the creation of representations in different states of Brazil, a regional spread of the Cinemateca Brasileira, amongst other decisions, which was also to publicize the CTAV collections and the Cinemateca collections. At the same time, the Brazilian Association for Audiovisual Preservation, ABPA, was created. The National Culture Plan, it is a law in Brazil, and it has been revised in 2008, and it's been revised now in 2020. Unfortunately, the revisions for this year have been done, let's say, with less participation from the sectors, which makes it difficult to include real demands. In 2009, as I said before, the Brazilian Institute was created due to very high demands in the museum sector in Brazil. We have over 3,000 museums, and most of them are public, either attached to the federal or to the state or municipal states. 2016, the Cinemateca Brasileira went under fire, and in the middle of that crisis, the Cinemateca requested the attachment to IBRAM, meaning it would be as if it was a museum managed by the IBRAM autarky agency, and therefore it would have independent management as well as a budget annually that would guarantee the preservation of audiovisual. Also, during 2016, the ABPA, the association, wrote the National Audiovisual Preservation Plan, which is still a draft, and it needs to be talked about and discussed among the sector as well as with the government. So in 2018, with the signature of the private non-organization company that decided to manage Cinematheca, the Cinematheca loses the council that was, since 1984, part of its structure. In 2019, the Cinematheque then goes under the Ministry of Citizenship as soon as Bolsonaro becomes president. It also loses, due to a flood, it loses professionals because of the signature with the with the Roquete Pinto, which is the company. And it also suffers a flood, losing over 10,000 DVDs of special collections and other documents that we have not been able to get access since the government has not done a thoroughly report. So in 2020, the Cinematheque loses the non-profit organization. Also, professionals were fired due to the cut of the contract in the middle of a COVID pandemic, which is illegal in Brazil to do so. And finally, it had to be shut down. Those are suggestions for sites that you could get access to various documents and histories of the Cinematheque, as well as the heritage and memory sector in Brazil. At the University of Brasilia, there is my master's dissertation. Unfortunately, it is in Portuguese, and I do not have it in English or Spanish or French. So thank you very much. I am sorry for my delay in this panel, and I hope we can talk a little bit right after this. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Fabiana, for that fantastic overview. I know a lot of us have been watching from afar and wanting to support our colleagues at the Cinematheque, so thank you so much. And we will have time for questions and answers at the end, again, of all 4 of our presentations. Let's see, so next up, we have Carolina Capa. The next 2 sessions are focused on Argentina. Carolina is at the Museo del Cine Pablo Ducros Hicken, and she is here with us to speak about Argentinian nitrate, an early cinema history. And we're delighted to have you. Welcome to FIAF.
Gracias, Rachel. Hola a todas y a todos.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rachel. I would like to clarify that this project that I will present to you today was prepared in the Film Museum, where I worked for more than 10 years, but I am not longer there. I am in Spain now. It is almost 3 p.m. here in Spain. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you, and thank you to the UNAM Film Archive. It would have been good to see you all in person, but it is good to see you here. I would like to share a video with you, and I am going to tell you something about it, about nitrato argentino, or Argentine nitrate. So nitrato argentino, Argentine nitrate, is a comprehensive preservation project for the movies from the Film Museum, and the products are a book, a website, a catalog, and some exhibitions of the early Argentinian films were restricted. So our project intended to bring together 2 main purposes. On the one hand, the archival practices and the need of the museum to preserve the collection by building a catalog, working on a preservation, digitization, and access of the films. On the other hand, we needed to build a history of the collection, not only on the aesthetic side, but also from a technological perspective, and we wanted to study the way in which films were developed in Argentina during the first years of the 20th century to make and process films. So we carried out our research from 2016 to 2020, and we started using the theories that have been applied on early film, and we tried to update them and enhance them for the Argentinian context. Usually these theories come from the United States or from Europe and are very rarely brought to other territories. However, the Argentine context had its own characteristics and its own features that needed or that called for us to modify those theories, and that is also applicable to other Latin American countries that are characterized by instability and semi-industrial development. So this is not a general study on silent Argentine films, but also on a collection of documents that survived early films and that were kept in the film museum. This collection consists of movies that were not shown or were not screened. There are some other records of social events or movies that were going to be screened on schools or fairs or congresses for religious purposes, for family purposes, or for scientific purposes, or travel movies. So they were all non-conventional films. So we had a few dilemmas from analyzing those movies. So those movies that survived in their original format were not commercially distributed. So in general, they did not belong to what we strictly knew as the Argentine silent film. And these movies were very rarely screened. And this is one of the first hypotheses of why these materials survived. They were not successful commercially, or they were not exchanged by film collectors. And these are films that were not put in the priority of the archives. The first silent Argentine feature film, Amalia, or the first full feature film, Muñequita Porteña, which are two landmarks of Argentine filmmaking, were given the attention and were curated. But these traditional notion of what an Argentine film is has separated these films, and they are a part of the historical storytelling of the times. Another problem we faced during the evaluation of these collection is that the documents or that the movies were fragmented. Although they survived, they were fragmented. So as Jacobson said in 1933, these are small sections with no titles or no intertitles, no credits, or no other reference to who the author of the movie is. Some of them have information in the original containers. So these meant quite a difficulty to catalog the movies, and they were considered as lost movies for a while, and they were left in the shelves of the archive and with only the warning that they were inflammable materials. So disaster is not a censorship or destruction, but rather the invisibilization of the archive. So you don't name it, it doesn't exist. It has been deliberately erased or vanished from history, and they are removed from the list of objects that are worth research. So our project tried to repair this fault, and at the same time giving them an archival identity and a historic identity. These are documents that survived in their original format, and they have to become part of the history of Argentine cinema, Argentine filmmaking. So the project initially had two sides. One that was mainly archival, and which implied identifying the materials that had been stored for such a long time, and there was no information whatsoever about them. Then we needed to create a catalog. These documents had not been mentioned by historians, and the materials themselves don't contain sufficient information about the authors and about the time in which they were made. And this means that many times they are disregarded for archival processes. So we need to, in order to catalog them, we need to research a lot. We need to really try to figure out all the information, marks, productions, errors, and then trace this back to the technical features and the content of the description of the content and any external sources that there might exist. Then we have to build a hypothesis and then draft information in our current language. So we created a catalog sheet per movie, and it was designed based on the old rules for movie cataloging of the FIAF. And but these were the old rules. Now I think that there's a team working on translating the new rules into Spanish, but we did what had been done with Rachel Abel and the Encyclopedia of Early Cinema and the Progetto Turconi. And we have also referred to the work of the Argentinian Lucio Mahfoud on his book, The Absent Image, on the Argentine silent films. So I'll tell you more about that. But first, I want to say that the second important part of the project was creating a historical context for filmmaking in Argentina. So we started studying about technology applied to the Argentinian context. We needed to identify these documents, but first we need to identify the technique that was used in their making. We have to study what were the processes and what was the technical process used to make the film, or the chemical processing of the film, because this is fundamental information that we need to include as film archivists for access to these very unique films. So we had a team of historians, archivists, some inspection technicians, audiovisual filmmakers. And so we had an interdisciplinary or a multidisciplinary team that has exceeded the boundaries of mere archival work. So Nitrato Argentino is a representation of all the work that is being done in the Film Museum of Argentina. So we wanted to vindicate the role of audiovisual archivists. Today, we can't just think of them as the guardians of some heritage objects, but we are key in interpreting the films, mainly when we are speaking about films that are so fragmented or so incomplete or that have been manipulated so much. So I would like to particularly highlight the role of the digital the digital restoration department of the museum. As I said, we needed to make extraordinary research, and I would like to mention Timeline of Film Historical Colors, coordinated by Barbara Fluckhiger, and Fantasian Colors from the Film Institute, who were critical for our work at Nitrato Argentina. So we found from all the restoration parties that the color has survived in a color that is not the original color of the film when it was screened, because they have been victims not only of the years and time, but we know that the laboratory practices at that time were not very standardized. And even if we have the color catalogs at that time, certainly the red applied by an industrial laboratory in the United States is not the same as that of a very rustic laboratory in Argentina, or the laboratory in La Pampa, which is one of the provinces in Argentina, would not apply the same colors as the ones that as the workshops in Buenos Aires. So for the time, it is very difficult to know, or impossible to know, what were the original colors of the film. So even if we were discouraged by this, we wanted to study the collection, the color of that collection in Nitrato Argentina. So we made a classification of the different colors and how they were applied, and their hues, their saturation, their intensity. So we ended up with 32 names of colors that could be combined depending on the on the technique applied, so we ended up with a wider array of colors. So this color study did not intend to become or to have the tools that were necessary to make a scientific study of colors. So what we wanted to do is give the spectators an experience of the complexity of the light and the colors that were in the that were given to the first films of Argentina. So we started. Our purpose was to finally come up with the colors that these movies had and show them between 2016 and 2020. So we hope that the restoration teams will be able to make better decisions regarding this ghost that is the original color of a film. So now we are looking at a film called Por las sendas de Uspallata, on the roads of Uspallata, which is from Cinematografía Valle, which was one of the largest production houses of the times, and it is tinted with a very, very mild pink and blue. And in ending, I would like to say that Nitrato Argentino has developed different strategies for this research project. Our strategies consisted of a book, a website, and different screenings of the films with live music. So we have our book, which is called Nitrato Argentino, A History of Filmmaking in the Early Times, published in October 2019. Our book has a full catalog of the films, in addition to some essays written by some of the archivists and the researchers of the Film Museum. These essays are tell the history of the films and their contexts, the technology and the color, and also have some notes about preservation and duplication. There's also a comparison between the common visual motifs that were seen time and again in the films of that time. And in addition to the book that you are seeing on screen now, we have our website, which is nitratoargentino.org. The book and our research were using fixed images or photograms in order to be able to study the elements of the images that we would miss if we were seeing them as a moving picture. So we know that we wanted to supplement the printed work with with a place where people could see the actual movies. So you can cross-reference the information. We have a catalog and the movies. We have also made special emphasis on identifying the materials used in the films, following the specific the technical specifications of the filmmaking and the brand and other features that were obtained or discovered from the observation of the material. We also include 500 digitized photograms and nearly 2/3 of all the digitized film documents. This is an open website that that everybody can have access to. It's worth saying that the quality of the films is variable. Some of them have been scanned in 2K, others have been scanned digitally, as the one that we are looking at right now about snakes. And this film was distributed by the National College of Buenos Aires, and others were digitized only for standard quality that was obtained from the hacking from Javier de Asque. So there was an inspection table that was obsolete and that had been completely disregarded by a commercial laboratory, so he reclaimed it and used it again. The Film Museum does not have the necessary budget for proper preservation of the film collections. So we obtained the funds from for the project from a grant that allowed us to buy basic equipment and pay the services for external staff. Human resources and technical resources are very scant in the museum. So I suppose that this is a familiar situation for Latin American archives, but I think that we still have to bring this to light until it is understood that this is the main problem of for our work. Nitrato Argentino has brought this to the attention because these films could have been lost. So far, we have not obtained the authorization from the city of Buenos Aires to publish the website of Nitrato Argentino. We hope that we can do this soon. So in the meanwhile, this website will be open to you during the days of the symposium so that you can watch the films and enjoy them. So this is our website address, and thank you very much for your attention. Hopefully we will be able to share with you during the debate.
Thank you so much, Carolina. What a fantastically gorgeous presentation. Absolutely gorgeous. I think from all of us who are excited to see film, that was spectacular. And I think this is really important for us to talk about. I think when we've talked in the past, even at the Second Century Forum last year about disasters, that this can fall into something that Paulo in his keynote this morning was talking about, right? Curatorship and what gets preserved. So early, more amateur sort of looking glimpses of life of Argentina that perhaps in the past weren't valued and money wasn't given to preserve it, that y'all have taken that sort of often overlooked material and are preserving it. Fantastic. So thank you for that. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end. I know we have some questions coming in now, and Hugo has also asked when you do ask questions to put in your country of residence when you're doing so. So thank you. So next up, we have one more conversation about Argentine cinema. I am happy to welcome Ana Lucia Amor de la Sociedad por el Patrimonio Audiovisual. Her paper topic is the destruction of Argentine cinema. Welcome, Ana Lucia.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Gracias a todos por el espacio, la oportunidad. Gracias a la FIAF, a la UNAM por el espacio. Bueno, como el resto de los paneles.
Thanks to FIAF and for the space. And I am going to share a PowerPoint while I read my presentation. So I would like to thank the interpreters for allowing us and facilitating communication. The destruction of Argentine film, and we started investigating about the disasters that have caused damage to the Argentine film heritage. It could be caused by negligence or by political reasons, but our cinema has suffered many losses that are not known. And we start from the premise that if you do not know what you are lost, you cannot grieve the loss. And grief, in general, as Freud says, is a reaction before the loss of somebody you love or something that replaces that person. And that is what happened with Argentinian films. But do we know what we have lost? Is the public aware of what we have lost? Has our society been able to grieve that loss? The Academy of the Spanish Language defines lack as something that you don't have. And this comes back to psychoanalysis. Doing what we need to do. If you lack something, you have a shortfall, you have an absence, you have a void. and that is what happens when a film is lost. And this is why audiovisual preservation can be explained ontologically. When we speak about the preservation of moving images in our country, we have to speak about the sad situations that happened in our country and the dictatorships during the 20th century. And when national film making began to grow, we had the de facto government of the 1930s, followed by the coup d'etat of the following years in the 40s, the 60s, the 70s. And Jose Miguel Consuelo said, so where are the old Argentine films? There are several films, foreign and national, that were censored, and they were censored during the time that were being filmed or when they were going to be increased. So we have Matías Sánchez Orondo, Ramiro de la Fuente, Paulino Tapia, who were the main censors, and the latter forbid the screening of 320 movies. And this censorship body was created at the end of the 70s, but was based on the beliefs of the Cinematographic Institute of Argentina, and they had some political views that were not only based on conservatism and the Catholic religion, but they became repressive. And we have been studying this, and we would like to refer to some of the interventions of de facto governments on the film heritage. So Glucksmann was a pioneer in the exploration of Argentine filmmaking, said that there were no measures adopted for the without regard for their quality. So now the files, the films would become part of the National Archives, and during the dictatorship, they were burned. So Glucksmann's archive is kept in 16 millimeters because between 1960 and 1967, the material was copied to security copies, and the same happened with Manuel Rodriguez Peña's archives, which were donated to the National Fund for the Arts, who are pioneering in promoting arts in the West. The originals were lost when nitrate 35 millimeters was discarded and replaced with 16 millimeter versions that could be lent for public or private screenings. This collection is kept in the Museum of the City of Buenos Aires, together with the rest of the archive, and was kept at the terrace on the headquarters, and they were exposed to the elements. So, censorship was not only a matter of the state, but sometimes it was also always the owners of the theaters who did not want to screen the movies. For example, Tararira, a movie that was directed by Benjamin Fondari, was lost because of this. In one of the studios that filmed this movie, they said that because he was not happy with the outcome, decided to burn the movie. El Hijo de Papá, directed by John Alton, was a complete failure. And as was said by Domingo de Inúbila, it was full of mistakes that were unforgivable, and they were of low taste, to the extent that Luis Andrini, who was the star of the movie, bought every copy of the pictures to be burned. And I quote, El Hijo de Papá was so poor that I bought the negative and all the copies, and with the money that I earned on that movie, I just burned them away in a property of mine. And this is what he confessed during an interview in the 1970s. So in addition to burning films, Argentina would also lose films to some disasters. One of the first big fires was the big fire of Casa Valle that occurred on April 1926.
The first movie of Cristiani, and some of the first films made in Antarctica and in the Patagonia of Argentina were in a building. This was a building that had labs and a film archive in a 120 square meter basement where the fire started because of the automatic or spontaneous combustion of this material. This was followed by other fires, which resulted in the crumbling of the building and affected some of the neighbors who, trying to flee the fire, jumped from the upper floors. The destruction was total. The Valle Cinematography company incorporated film into its schools that Valle, an entrepreneur, had invested heavily in. A decade later, Valle tried fruitlessly for the state to purchase his film archive. He needed money, and the remainder of the films, after purchasing a company which was going to try to take advantage of the purchase of celluloid. All of these disasters have occurred in the capital city and in Buenos Aires. A great number of the film archives are located there because of the characteristics of Argentina, and not only because of high temperatures during the summer season, but of the high variation not only of temperatures, but in humidity. There was a fire in 1940s of Sonofilm, founded in 1933, and was one of the most important film companies of the so-called talkies during that period. Thanks to the efforts of firemen and of the technicians that were there present, we can see the video that was made, or the film that was made of the fire. In the report published in the La Nación newspaper the next day, the day yesterday was affected by the extreme heat, and a fire was started in the Almagro neighborhood. Despite the efforts of the firemen, the EFA and San Miguel studies also in January of 1955 had fires. The Semanario Argentino newsreel reported that the fire brigades were not sufficient to contain the fires that affected these film archives and film companies. Millions and millions of were lost in the fires that affected principally film companies. Other disasters occurred as a result of storing nitrate film products without the appropriate preservation and steps. Enrique Bouchard, a film collector, recalls that his own home was burned, and he lost a son in that fire. And his own film storage was lost from a fire that lasted 2 days. In 1950, a building burned because of an explosion, because of the spontaneous combustion of film stored there, and a 10-year-old boy killed while he was sleeping. Towards the end of the 1950s, a number of film production companies had their entire archives and film collections lost because of the spontaneous fires caused by the storage of nitrate films. The Interamericana company, whose own building was closed due to a bankruptcy, and this affected the nearby Cristiani labs, film labs, that also were affected by a fire in 1961. Other fire brigades worked to contain the fire that also reached nearby homes. The final fire was in January of 1969 and almost completely destroyed what existed at the time. About 3,000 negative cellulose and nitrate reels from Sonofilm and Uniton and Artistas Asociados and General Belgrano studios were lost forever, stored in the Sales laboratory vault, which also was affected by a spontaneous combustion produced. There were 8 victims and injured persons as the fire affected nearby slums and residences. This led to controversies and accusations in the years that followed. Juan José Husil confessed to La Nación newspaper an episode that occurred toward the end of the 1980s. A flood during a number of months covered the Alex studios. A film canister appeared to be an alien that was covered by moss. I thought it had been lost forever. So I hired a person that spent 3 months cleaning photogram by photogram with cotton, and it was able to be saved. But many films were lost forever. In 1990, Octavio Getino, who at the time was in charge of the National Film Institute, sued because of the loss of the 3 films from the Alex studios. According to Carlo Fagna, a historian of film in Argentina, said that only the Mano en la Trampa film, Un Guapo del 900, and Piel de Verano were Leopoldo Torrenilso's 3 emblematic historic films. In 1992, Fernández Jurado also reported, at the time in charge of the Museum of Cinema Buenos Aires, who found films lost in trash containers outside of film studios. And the report was that some of these were discarded and trash material. Other material recovered from Laboratorios Alex were sent to be recovered, and those that transported mixed the various film reels, and they stored them in a basement that was not prepared for such storage and was subject to flooding. These sad conditions were the situation in which we finished the 20th century. The Assistance Committee created by José Miguel Onainda as director of the National Film Institute, and joined by others like Fernando Solanas and Fernando Martín Peña, among others, sought to rescue and carry out through a new entity, Afrosinaín. This led to not only the recovery of our cinema, but also to prepare work for future generations. One example of this is the work that we just heard from Carolina Capa. The image of seeing film reels in the trash heap would repeat again. In 1998, Fernando Solanas found near the Cinecolor lab copies of La Hora de los Hornos and El Exilio de Gardel thrown away in a trash heap. And I quote, "They are so new at doing this that they don't even know which the main historical films of Argentina's film history are." Chile Films, which had just been, which had recently purchased that film studio. There was also a mention that Los Hijos de Fierro, El Viaje, and a number of short and feature-length films. The company had apparently started a number of reforms and did not have room to store its films. The trustee of Cinecolor responded to Solanas' argument, saying that directors and producers had simply abandoned because it wasn't the purpose of the film company to be either an archive or a film collection. Fernando Vire was also found. And faced with the digitalization in 2011, this happened again. Distributors lost all of the copies of their celluloid films, and the Museum of Film also, through something that was also brought up in a lawsuit started by workers from these film institutes that requested appropriate work conditions. Actors and actresses of Argentina's cinema started a campaign denouncing and criticizing the conditions in which film was being kept in this institution. And presently, the film vault is in a rented building. Another environmental catastrophe happened in 1991 when the Cinematheque Argentina Foundation had a wall that fell down. This was in an old building in the Once neighborhood in Buenos Aires. And an excavation was being carried out in a nearby building without any protective measures. And this caused various difficult situations due to the exposure to the climate. In many cases, negatives as well as film copies were sent out of the country as to either make copies or to participate in film festivals, and they were never returned, or they were held in customs, as is the case of the negative copies of La Raulito, which when it returned from Spain was simply destroyed by the customs authorities. In some cases, La Fuga of Luis Saldasky was recovered because of being found by the UNAM film collection. This is part of the saddest chapter of our film history. In the decade of 1960, the Cinematography Institute said that it couldn't meet its important debts, and Estudio San Miguel faced the same fate. And it is almost all of the collection of Artistas Argentinos Asociados is up on the auction block. And other numerous important films will suffer this fate. These are not the only cases that I have told, because I'm not able to give an exhaustive report, but I also don't want to forget to mention what happened in 1920 in film studios or in film houses or in television studios. In 1992, Canal 11 lost most of its historic film archives. In 1960, the film collection of Canal 7, Channel 7, and Channel 9 in Buenos Aires. It's often the case that film collections are found in the trash, whether they are industrial or family private collections. And historic films and old technology, new digital supports, and all of the supporting and documentary material has been lost as well. Argentina still doesn't have a single film vault for nitrate collections. A lawsuit that was begun to address this issue was mysteriously lost by the National Audiovisual Institute. And the law on explosives includes nitrocellulose, but not films that are made on this medium, despite the international recommendations and standards which are to be followed. Thank you very much for all of you who followed us.
Muchas gracias, Ana Lucia. I think some of these stories are familiar to all of us around the world. I think we all share histories of our cultural heritage. So much of our film has been lost through fires or neglect, or seeing them in dumpsters is always heartbreaking, especially the more recent images. But this is a really great opportunity to have this discussion, I think. So we do have about 30 minutes for questions and answers, and we've had a few pop up in our Q&A. And again, Hugo asked if you could put your country of origin. And we have, we can start with perhaps one that came up during Carolina's talk about, I think it's just about cataloging, and if you have an OPAC system. Can you see the questions also or not? ¿Tienen algún sistema, okay, if you have an integrated library system?
No, we don't have. We have a system that is being implemented, or that has been implemented for a long time, because it needs to be integrated to the rest of the museums of the city. So now we are cataloging with some templates, but the important thing here is that we have the proper and the right cataloging fields for proper identification.
Rico question. Sorry, I'm just scanning through. I have sorry. Some of these are longer questions or opportunities, requests to speak, clarifying. Let's see. Sorry, there's so many things popping up here. Yes, Hugo, Paula Felix Dedier would like to actually address, and what I'm not sure, Hugo, is if they're allowed to turn on their cameras.
Give me a second. If you want, go ahead with another question and we'll figure out a technical way to do it, okay?
Great. So Paulo will figure out an opportunity for you to be able to speak. Okay. Juana, so some of these are in Spanish. El libro del Museo del Cine debe ser...
the book of the Film Museum should be translated to several languages. Congratulations.
Absolutely.
Translated into several languages. Gracias, Juana. Ojalá que así sea.
We are translating it into several languages, so we hope we can have it translated. It's in Spanish for now, but the idea of this work was to actually provide a new tool regarding technique for Spanish speakers, because we've always been reading in English and in French, and we thought that it would be good to have a product in Spanish. It was deliberately written in Spanish.
Okay, here's a straight up question about what scanner is being used. So from Christopher Grove from the National Film and Video Sound Archives in South Africa, what scanner is being used to scan the nitrate tinted films? In Carolina's presentation.
Bueno, no me extendí demasiado en ese...
Well, I didn't speak much about that because I only had 20 minutes, but as I was telling you, our project was unable to make long-term preservation of the films because we don't have a scanner. We had the opportunity to use a scanner of the radio and TV archive of Argentina, which we use to digitize several materials, and those are the ones that can be seen better. But as I told you, the materials were digitized only for preview, in a retrofitted table that was which is an inspection table that was retrofitted, and we the rest of them are queuing up for restoration.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to do something a little bit unusual. Have Paula Felix de Dier speak. We are not anticipating having a big one-on-one debate, but as head of the organization that was discussed, I know you have a couple of corrections you would like to share. Paula.
Hello, and thank you very much. I'm going to be very brief. I'll just want to point two inaccuracies in the last presentation. One, where it says that the Peña Rodriguez collection was in a terrace at some point in the open air. That is not true. The Peña Rodriguez collection is famous for the Metropolis print. And well, that was not the case with that collection. And the second inaccuracy is that the museum threw away films, and there were some pictures. Those pictures are not pictures of actual films being thrown away. It was only empty cans and garbage. That's the only thing I would like to say. The other things are accurate about the situation of our nitrate vault, and that we are trying to hopefully have a new one in place. So thanks so much, and that's it.
Thank you so much, Paula. We have a question. Sutsu, I think, is asking about Carolina, how this project came about, that these opportunities don't always come up. Can you see that question, Carolina?
Sí, puedo verla. ¿Cómo se genera un proyecto como este? A veces parece que hay un...
How do you build a project like this? Sometimes it seems that we would have to wait to have the perfect conditions. As Roque and Circe, the conditions are never perfect. They are never perfect, and at least in Latin America. So we need to continue doing that, and the project emerged in that place there in the museum, because there was a personal interest of myself and from many of my peers in the museum about the materiality of filmmaking. So this is why we sought funds, and this is how we obtained the grant from the government of the city of Buenos Aires that gave us a little budget that so that we could make more publications, and that we could work more on what we were already doing in the museum. But it is like that. We don't have to wait for the perfect moment and the perfect conditions, because waiting in situations like ours could mean catastrophe. A catastrophe would be that keeping those materials, just put it somewhere in a shelf and doing nothing about it. But the way of preserving it is by manipulating it, cataloging it, and saving it, even within the very scant time and financial resources that we might have.
Thank you so much. Juana Suarez asked Roque, it would be important for purposes for a good record. We need to make a difference between extensive in production and extensive in years. Colombia has a film history that goes back to 1897 with the first lost film. Oops, the questions pop up as more come in. The law on cinema 2013 is important, but there have been efforts to safeguard film heritage since 1986 and earlier. There's a lot of literature on the history of Colombian cinema. Okay. I'm trying to read through the ones that are questions and comments at the same time. If a panelist sees an individual comment, perhaps directed at you, that I might
¿Podría hacer un pequeño comentario? Perdón.
I would like to add something there, if I may.
Yes, please.
Well, I replied there. You are right, Juana. with what you said, but as I said, this is not a presentation on Colombia and all of their heritage and their and what they have in film, the full history. This is why it doesn't focus only on heritage, but also on disasters. And I would like to add, when she says a production, emphasis in production that follows history of 2013, but that doesn't happen only in Colombia. Distribution, exhibition, recovery, reclaim, dissemination is completely in full disadvantage compared to production. And that happens in Latin America, particularly after the 1990s. And that is the only comment I have. This is not something that doesn't happen only in Colombia. And I didn't speak in depth of the whole history of Colombian filmmaking and audiovisual history because it would have been too long. But I do want to underscore that there are important efforts being made, particularly after the law on cinema in 2013 was enacted. There are several national and federal organizations that are working together, like the National Archives and the Ministry of Culture, that are working together. There is a yearly reunion of film archives that basically doesn't exist anywhere in Latin America. Then we have CIAPAC, who is in charge of having the different filmmaking institutes throughout the country. Several efforts have been made, and I have been invited to speak at several conferences. But however, there are many things to be done. And there are some highlights that are worth mentioning, basically for the rescue of Colombia's film heritage.
All of the questions just disappeared. I think there were still some outstanding ones. Fabiana, I think there's a question about, is the closure of the Cinematheque permanent?
Okay, thank you for the question. The situation is quite complex at the moment. The Cinematheque is closed. There are no professionals taking any care of any of the collections. What the government has done so far for the past 50 days, it is to implement security and cleaning services and a fire brigade who has no specialization on monitoring the film collection. However, the professionals who are not attached to the Cinematheque anymore were allowed to go into the vaults once a week to measure temperature and humidity. We do know that that's not enough, but that's all the government has done so far. As far as we have done, the Association for Audiovisual Preservation, the Brazilian BPA, which is the association that I am part of, we have met with the government this past week, and we have begun discussions on opening an open call for the new non-private organization that will manage the Cinematheque. However, this is not enough. We do know that the humidity in Brazil is very high. We don't have professionals ready to take action at the moment. It is a very serious situation, and we would love to request FIAF to be part of manifestos that would enforce pressure to the government to take some kind of action that is of an emergency. We need an emergency protocol that could be signed by the government that would allow the professionals who were already there to go in and monitor the situation until the official situation has been closed and signed a new contract, which may take 3 to 6 months. because bureaucracy in Brazil is very complex, and also because we are coming towards the end of the year when budgets are slim. And we do have an announce from the government that the culture sector will be cut in 80% of its budget for 2021. So we will have 20% of the entire culture budget to manage all our equipment, which is obviously impossible. I hope I answered the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question from Brazil to Carolina. Who pays for the amazing work on nitrate films, private or public? And then for everyone, and I think we could spend the next 8 hours explaining the history of nitrate fires and the explosive nature of that early format. But Carolina, would you like to answer the first part of the question?
Sí. Bueno, un poco lo comenté antes, el programa de mecenazgo cultural es un programa.
I said that we have a cultural grant from the government that calls also on private institutions to contribute to this cultural grant. So it is a part funded by the but with public funds. Our salaries, for example, were paid from government funds, but we also had part of the funds provided by private institutions. So it is a PPP, a mixed funding.
Also related to that last comment about the Cinematheque, Christophe Dupin of FIAF has written in that he's in weekly contact with the Cinematheque. So I think that conversation is ongoing right now. So on behalf of FIAF. Okay, there were some other questions in general. We had someone from Spain asking in general about that we're speaking about film archives because we are the International Federation of Film Archives, and we're talking specifically about loss. The question was, what about other materials? What about the ancillary? I'm assuming paper and audio and things like that, and that this can be a big problem if they're not being preserved and digitized. It is, of course, of interest, I will just speak for all of us, of all film archives as well. Our concentration today is really talking about films, but if anybody wants to pipe in to comment further about that, I didn't want to overlook that question, however.
Bueno, yo simplemente contarles una cuestión. En
I would
realidad,
simply comment on something that is related to this and has to do with the same system of public and private financing of cultural institutions. I understand that we're also working on the preservation of the film machinery and the this is another way of us understanding how the films were made. And to address one of the issues that Paola was mentioning initially, a film conservationist, more than worrying about how films will survive, needs to understand or try to explain how films have been projected, and it also works on the area of how films will be projected in the future. So that's also part of what's happening in Argentina as such.
Thursday.
I also would like to make a comment and to go back to what Ana Lucia Amor has mentioned in terms of the lack of protective measures. Sometimes when we haven't identified, as Carolina Capa has said, what material we have stored, we generally have focused on conservation, preservation, digitalization, but many times we have left aside a correct identification of what this involves, of formats of film support. And so this is what we're going to leave for future generations. So a correct description of what is contained here so that the archive knows what it holds. And if we add to that issues of censorship or the fact that many times governmental authorities or authorities in charge of financing and funding the the funding of these institutions, not the people who are in charge of the institutions necessarily themselves. This is an additional pressure, both institutionally and interinstitutionally. I think in Latin American countries particularly, but in general, I think this is a problem that we need to learn to face. Thank you. Thank you for the time and the opportunity to respond. And if I could, I would add 30 seconds to another question that was asked, if you will allow, Rachel. I'm asked by a colleague in Argentina, could we think about categories of alarms when faced with negligence? But when we're not talking about something very specifically like femicide, because this is very controversial when it has to do with issues of marriage, and I didn't want to leave aside the importance, the great importance. Of course, it's enormously important, and punishment must be even greater. And there's an enormous historical debt that we have of approving laws to protect the rights of women, the bodies of women. But I also think that it is extremely serious for us to think about I think it's equally important, the disregard for the cultural heritage. And perhaps the public who might be hearing us could think that this simply has to do with documents and papers and isn't something so serious. But thinking out loud, the issue here is, and it is much more serious, this affects life when there are explosions and fires that can kill people. So it isn't only the matter of documents and historical issues. I didn't mention it, but the biological heritage also is we are patenting our flora, our fauna. We are seeing that there are efforts internationally to patent and to replicate synthetically the natural patrimony of our countries and our communities. So this is something that should be extremely punished and very severely considered. Thank you.
I think at this point, we've reached the end of our session. And I know Hugo had to leave, but I wanted to thank all of our panelists so much for sharing and for all the questions and answers and participants and so many people. So nice to see your names at least. I'm so sad that we're not able to see all of you in person. I want to remind you that this is day 1 of 4 of the FIAF Symposium. So we want to make sure that you're coming every day. And I think tomorrow's is a little bit earlier, so pay attention to the times. I think if we look back and when we started with Paulo, he managed to bring so many different themes and streams together, from social injustice, which has been raised today, political concerns, the precarious state of film exhibition and film production, the pandemic, I Can't Breathe. I think we're going to see sort of some of these continued streams going on throughout the week. But I can't thank our panelists enough. I think all of these issues are so important to our field, to our preservation, to our history, to our memories. So thank you all for contributing. And thanks again to the UNAM staff and all you film techs who've been part of this. Muchas gracias. And there's a poll. Sorry, I'm just seeing that. If you have noticed, there's a little poll that's come up, I think a little survey. So please fill that out. Sarah, apologies for not seeing that earlier.